G'day, Daniel here from Living Entertainment North Coast, and as you can see behind me I have a pair of the KEF LSX as well as a pair of the KEF LS50 Wireless Mark II. And that's because it's finally time to make good on my promise from the unboxing video. This is my in-depth breakdown and review of the new KEF LS50 Wireless model. I'm going to be talking about music, I'm going to be talking about movies, and I'm going to be talking about playing video games, so let's get into it. So before I get into the performance of the new KEF LS50 Wireless, I think it's really important to talk about the changes in this new model when compared to the previous iteration, or at least the changes that stood out most to me personally. Now, the biggest thing in terms of the way I was using these particular speakers was the removal of the USB input from the previous model, and this has been superseded with a HDMI Arc input. Now, as someone who usually at home is using a pair of the KEF LSX with their television through an optical cable, this of course meant that I could cut down my remote usage from 2 to 1, which might not sound like a big deal for most people, but I can assure you for my partner, it kind of made a huge difference. It also means that the speakers automatically switch on when your television does, which sounds like a small thing, but it is a greatly appreciated convenience. Now, something else that has changed is the reset button on the back. With the original model, it was a small recessed switch that you kind of needed to use something like a pen in order to access. But now it's a regular push button that just needs to be held down for a number of seconds. And this isn't something that's going to affect 95% of users, but if you're someone that moves around a lot or likes to tweak their network, or you're like me and you need to be able to take speakers from one location to another for work, it is a massive time saver. And it really makes a difference when setting the speakers up on different networks as need be. Now, something else that was an immediate improvement over the previous iteration of both the LS50 Wireless and the KEF LSX is how quickly the source signal can be switched. It doesn't matter if the speakers are coming out of standby mode or if I was swapping from Spotify Connect to the television or vice versa. It usually took less than a second, which is a substantial jump from the previous iterations, which take 2 to 3 seconds. Again, that doesn't sound like a huge thing, but when you're used to how things were, it's greatly appreciated and just makes things feel that much more snappy and easy to use. The remote control has also seen a boost. It is much more user-friendly now in its layout. It feels a little bit more polished in terms of design, I guess you'd say. And it's got a little bit more of a tactile feel to the buttons, which I appreciated. I didn't find myself using the remote control very much now that HDMI Arc is built into the system, but it is something that I think is worth praise. But these are just the features that stood out most to me while I was using them at home. KEF have also made a host of other improvements to these speakers over the previous iteration. First of all, there is the sharp increase in power with this particular system. The original model had 30 watts of Class AB power dedicated to the tweeter, and that has now been boosted up to an incredible 100 watts. Meanwhile, the 200 watts of Class D power that was originally dedicated to the mid and bass driver has been boosted all the way up to 280 watts. So a pretty substantial increase there. There is also the inclusion of KEF's new Meta materials, or MAT, and this promises to get rid of 99% of unwanted sound and distortion. And of course, this is a feature that was carried over from the new KEF LS50 Meta passive bookshelf speakers. And of course, on top of all this, KEF has seen fit to include support for DSD 256 as well as MQA, so all you high-res fans out there are covered. Lastly, the largest and what I think is the most important improvement with these particular speakers is the brand new KEF Control app, which rolls KEF Control and KEF Stream from the previous iterations of their active speaker range together into one app. And it really is a night and day difference from these previous versions. Now, setting these speakers up through the new app took me all of 90 seconds, and it was an absolute breeze. But if you are an Android person, you should probably be aware that the app actually sets your speakers up through Google Home. So if that's an app you haven't had any experience with, it's definitely something to take into consideration and maybe do a little bit of research on beforehand. So all in all, a pretty big upgrade all around. But the question is, what does that mean for the sound? Now, I imagine most of you are here for music, and so I think it makes sense to use that as a launching point. But first of all, I feel like I should probably talk about the way I had this particular system set up while I was using it at home. So from my perspective, the fact that these speakers contain a HDMI Arc input tells me that they are kind of targeting people who are either looking at getting into hi-fi for the first time or people who are looking at downsizing their current setup. And while I definitely wouldn't say KEF have marketed these speakers as a soundbar replacement, they definitely have the functionality to do just that. And that's exactly how I tested them. So I wanted to use a setup that you could consider to be an average user sort of scenario. So I had my HDMI Arc coming from my TV to the speakers, and the media source when I wasn't using the wireless functionality was the Xbox Series X, and I was using that as a CD transport and Blu-ray player. So now that you have an understanding of the setup I was using, let's talk tunes. So for my music sources, I was using Spotify Connect as it's what I mainly use at home, as it's just most convenient to me in the way I live. And I was using, as I mentioned earlier, CDs through the Xbox Series X as a CD transport. Now, my lounge room is far from optimal when it comes to sound, but like most people, I have to make the best out of what I have. And what surprised me straight away was just how wide that soundstage was, despite how unoptimal my lounge room actually is. Not only was the soundstage wide, but the actual imaging within that soundstage was always very detailed, very well defined, and incredibly precise. Now, my lounge room is optimized for the KEF LSX, that's what I'm using at home, and I was surprised to find that I actually had to lean forward a little bit in order to really get the benefits of that particular sweet spot, and I ended up moving the lounge forward. But what made this extra interesting is how much wider the sweet spot presented itself than the LSX or indeed the previous LS50 wireless in this particular room. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the speaker's sweet spot seems to have sacrificed depth in order to have gained width, which when you look at it in the context of something with HDMI Arc, so something that people will watch movies or television with, you want that wider sweet spot because usually on a lounge, there's more than one person sitting down watching something, which isn't necessarily the way you might listen to music. Now, in my particular case, I couldn't move the speakers any further apart. I simply didn't have room on my cabinet. So instead, I moved my lounge forward. Not a big deal. And it raises the question, do I think it was a sacrifice worth making? And yeah, I think it makes sense given the context of the inputs of the system. So if your lounge room is already set up and you're happy with how it is, you might need to play around with the placement of these particular speakers before you're really happy with the sound, and that's fine. It's just something to be aware of. But you'll know when you're in the perfect spot because it goes from being a wall of sound directly in front of you to something that feels almost all-encompassing. You really can feel it all around you when you're in that perfect zone. Now, sound itself is relatively linear. There is just a hint of color there, just enough to keep things feeling lively and exciting. And in terms of composure, they had absolutely no problems handling music by the likes of Aphex Twin or Death Grips at high volumes. They just kept going as if it was nothing, which is exactly what you want. Now listening to the likes of Mac Miller and Vince DiCola, you could really feel the snappiness, the tightness, the punch of the drums. But then you could move to something like Laura Marling or First Aid Kit, and there's a sweetness to the sound, to the vocals that really comes through with these, which is greatly appreciated. And then there is the size of the sound. Given the small nature of the drivers on these particular speakers, they really do feel infinitely larger than they actually are. Listening to artists like Future Islands or Jeremy Soule, the sound felt immense. It felt huge or epic, if you will. Now, in terms of audio differences from the previous iteration, the main thing that I picked up on was at higher volumes, the previous iteration, there was a sparkle at the top there, which I personally found could become a little much. Now, my go-to album for testing this particular quality is The Knife Silent Shout, which was quite taxing to listen to on the previous iteration, but after listening through it on the KEF LS50 Wireless Mark IIs, I didn't have any issues at all. And while I certainly wouldn't call it a relaxing listen, it was definitely a pleasant one. So I'm glad to see that that little sparkle at the top there has been toned down quite a bit. Now, something I did want to bring up was the sound quality of Spotify through these speakers. Obviously, Spotify is a compressed, lossy streaming service. And while it sounds fine at low to medium volumes on these particular speakers, the transparency of them kind of highlights the compression once you start getting up there in volume. Thankfully, a couple of days ago, Spotify actually announced their plans to add CD quality streaming to the Spotify Connect functionality. So hopefully this is only going to be a temporary issue, but at the time of filming this, it is something to be aware of if Spotify is your main music source. CDs, on the other hand, sounded fantastic, and honestly, they kind of surprised me with the audio quality coming out of the Series X there as a CD transport. It sounded better than I expected. But of course, music is only part of the equation. There is that new HDMI Arc input to talk about. So I think it's time we started talking about videos and movies. Now, a little bit of a disclaimer up front here. Be careful what audio signal you're feeding into these speakers because they will only take in a PCM signal. So there is no automatic surround sound down mixing here. And if your source does not do a good job of down sampling surround sound into stereo, you're not going to have a good time. Thankfully, my Xbox Series X does a fantastic job of down mixing, but when listening to things that were being streamed through the Chromecast, things could get a little bit squiffy. And by squiffy, I just mean the sound mix could be a little bit unbalanced, and sometimes dialogue wasn't as clear as it should have been. So that's definitely something to be aware of. I imagine for those of you out there using a modern smart TV, however, this shouldn't be an issue, but there is a disclaimer all the same. Now, in my personal opinion, the most important thing when I'm testing a 2-channel stereo system in a home theater sort of setup is the quality of that phantom center channel, how clear the dialogue comes through and how transparent it is. Now, we watched a lot of YouTube and we watched a lot of movies and television through these speakers, and at no point did we have any issues with the clarity of dialogue coming through. And it wasn't just me sitting in the center of the couch either. As I said earlier, that sweet spot which was there during the music makes a big difference when watching television as well, as it didn't matter if I was to the left or the right of the couch, there was never any sort of issues. Now, while watching films like Jurassic Park, there was still that level of weight to a lot of the sound effects. There was an incredible amount of detail in the sound mix, which again, this was being down mixed and I was hearing things in the mix I'd never noticed before. So again, the DAC in here is doing a lot of the heavy lifting in this regard and pulling out detail that you might not realize was there, especially through a 2-channel stereo setup. And don't even get me started on how good John Williams' soundtrack was. But at the same time, it felt like something was missing, which wasn't my experience with music. So even if you're in a small room like what I was using at the time, I would recommend pairing these with a subwoofer if you're looking at watching a lot of movies with them. Now, this lack of bass wasn't as much of an issue when watching YouTube videos, obviously, or television, or indeed the second movie I watched, which was Pink Floyd's The Wall. It sounded absolutely fantastic as it was. And the last movie I watched with these speakers, I would almost say it didn't need a subwoofer. It sounded pretty much perfect, actually, as it was. That movie was actually, and don't laugh, Dragon Ball Super Broly. Now I'm laughing. This obviously isn't a movie for everyone, but I had an absolute blast watching it with these particular speakers. It sounded awesome. But of course that comes down to the sound design of the film. There is not a lot of bass emphasis in the mix. It is full of quick, snappy, punchy, both literal and figurative sound effects, and they just lend themselves incredibly well to the sound qualities of the KEF LS50 Wireless II. Of all the film and television content I watched on these speakers, if I was going to pick something to show them off, ironically, this Dragon Ball movie would actually be my choice, just because, yeah, the qualities just align perfectly. Again, don't laugh. So overall, would I recommend these speakers as a soundbar replacement for film and television? And the answer is, if you can stretch it, yes, I absolutely would. I don't really have any complaints other than the potential lack of bass in some more cinematically mixed films. But then that also raises the question of a subwoofer. Do you need one? But I think that's the wrong question. I think the real question is, are you planning on using these speakers as a music first system and a film system second? Or are you more interested in watching films with music as an afterthought? Because in a room of a similar size to what I'm using at home, if you're mainly listening to music, no, I don't think you need a subwoofer. I don't think you do at all. But if movies are your thing and music's just like a tasty bonus, I would probably recommend getting a subwoofer to pair up with these. Now, because I know some of you in the comment section will ask me what subwoofers I would personally recommend pairing with these, I would recommend the KEF KC62, as aesthetically it's designed to match, and it's an incredibly small subwoofer with a small footprint. And we've also tried them with the JL Audio 108 and the 110, and it pairs really well with those as well. So obviously there's a lot of information we can gather from the experience using these with both movies and music, but there is of course something which gives me a little bit more control over how exactly the soundstage is placed, and that's video games. So let's talk console gaming. Now, despite the fact these tests were done with next-gen gaming hardware, these are all last-gen titles, and that is simply because I'm really familiar with the sound mix of these particular games, so please bear that in mind. But the first game I tested was Forza Horizon 3, so this is a long-term favorite of mine, not just for fun, but for benchmarking audio. And it really did not take long for the LS50 Wireless II to really start showing off just how well they can handle incredibly complex audio situations. Now, playing Forza 3, the speakers have to deal with the revving of engines, things whizzing past the screen. There is the musical score playing in the background, as well as the radio and voiceover. This is all going on at once. It's incredibly noisy. And at no point was there any dip in clarity or any sense of muddiness. They held together, even at high volumes, like it was nothing. The engines in particular sounded gravelly. They were textured. They were coarse, which is exactly what you want out of a nice V8. The only thing I really noted was that when navigating the user interface, there was sometimes a little bit too much brightness potentially. This is something that's pretty common in a lot of games I've noticed, and it was definitely toned down a lot more from the previous iteration. And honestly, I think this is more of an issue with the sound effects game designers choose for their user interface designs than a fault of the speakers, but it's really the only time that it ever stood out to me. Now, next up was Dark Souls Remastered, and this was chosen specifically for its use of diegetic sound design. Now, the game's environments and background sounds came through with an incredible level of clarity, and I could notice a lot of sounds that I've never really picked up on before. And that's despite finishing this game probably 40 or 50 times now. The sound of swords on shields and armor was appropriately abrasive without ever being obnoxious. And what kind of really caught me off guard was how the wide soundstage really did make those vast open expanse areas feel genuinely large and wide. But when you moved into more narrow spaces, such as say the depths, you actually kind of felt the sound itself narrow, which kind of wasn't something I was expecting or ever really noticed before. There was a genuine level of claustrophobia to the sound design and to the soundstage in these moments, and that's just, I don't know, not something I was expecting. Or maybe it's just always been there, but these speakers are what made me take notice. And of course, much has been said of Dark Souls soundtrack, but Firelink Shrine has never felt like such a respite, at least not to me. Lastly, I wanted to try Battlefield 1, and that was for two reasons. First of all, when I'm testing audio hardware, it's always my #1 choice. The soundscape is highly dynamic, both in terms of what's happening and in terms of the levels of these sounds present in it. It just has an incredible, rich feel and sound to it. Secondly, it supports Dolby Atmos for headphones, which sounds like a weird thing to mention in a speaker review, and I'm going to come back around to that. Again, Battlefield 1, an incredible level of clarity and accuracy in its imaging. At no point did I have any issues working out exactly where enemy fire was coming from, even if it was behind me. I could feel the impact of every explosion, I could feel the kickback from every shot of my rifle, and while in the tank, I could hear every single bullet case bouncing on the metallic floor. It was an incredibly immersive experience, and almost hard to believe that it was only in 2-channel stereo. And that's where I come back around to the Dolby Atmos for headphone support. You might be wondering why you would want to use an app like this when you're listening in 2-channel stereo, and it's quite a simple answer, and that's because when using this particular app, you get access to a far more rich, far more detailed, and far more dynamic sound mix. And it does definitely have its benefits. I particularly noticed a jump in the quality and the depth of the upper mid-range, but it did come at the sacrifice of the audio's accuracy. Because obviously, the speakers aren't here, they're here. Now, it's still a perfectly fine way to play, and I think it's something that if you have access to the app, you should definitely mess around with, but your mileage may vary. Still, it was an interesting experiment, and I'm glad that I did it. So overall, gaming with the KEF LS50 Wireless II, I had a very, very positive experience. So positive, in fact, that I thought I'd test it again with something else a little more unorthodox. Now, I'm going to get into some pretty damn niche stuff here, so if you just want to jump to my final thoughts, feel free to jump to the time code on the screen. Now, while I was working on this particular project, I managed to gain access to a practically brand new PlayStation 2, and of course, me being me, I wanted to know just what the sound quality of something of that vintage was like when running through something a little bit more modern, both in terms of PlayStation 2 titles and PlayStation 1, which of course had a very, very particular sound chip. And my findings were surprising, to say the least. Now, first of all, I used the PlayStation 2's on-board DAC, as that's how 99% of people would have heard it when it was initially released. So that was using the RCAs, and the sound was really, really flat and pretty unimpressive. And I think that's how a lot of us remember it. But man, you jump to the optical and it's like you're listening to an entirely different system. And seeing as DACs have come so far in the last 20 years, I don't think anything was engineered with the amount of detail and clarity we'd have now in mind. First of all, I tested Tekken Tag Tournament, and these speakers with their wonderful, wonderful DAC, their incredible transparency and detail, they really kind of highlighted a couple of things. First of all, the compression in the sound effects and voiceover, which, considering that these started out on an arcade board, that makes sense. But what they also highlighted was just how good the soundtrack to Tekken Tag is. It's awesome. And surprisingly, it actually sounded better, to my ears at least, than what I could hear through services like Tidal. I don't know what the deal is, how the audio is compressed on that particular title. If the audio is compressed at all, I don't know how much space the soundtrack takes up on the DVD, but it sounded absolutely fantastic. The other PlayStation 2 title I tried was Burnout 3, and it wasn't quite as lucky. In some senses, it was superior. Obviously, being a racing game as opposed to a fighting game, the soundtrack was a lot more imaging focused. Hearing things whizzing past the vehicle sounded really, really cool. The engine sounded pretty damn nice. And on that side of things, it sounded really, really good. But these speakers also kind of highlighted the compression that was on literally every aspect of the game's audio. And given that that was a late PlayStation 2 title, and by then they were kind of really struggling to fit all of the sound effects onto a DVD with all the other information, that kind of makes sense. So in regards to listening to PlayStation 2 games, it was kind of an interesting experiment, and it showed me two sides of a particular coin there. Appreciated some things that they brought forward with it, and other things kind of highlighted the issues with the hardware of the era. But not just satisfied there, I thought I'd also try a couple of PlayStation 1 games, because they work quite differently, and that was a very different experience again. So first of all, Crash Bandicoot. Up until this point, I'd only ever really heard the game running on a CRT TV, and of course in that situation the left and right channels were very, very close together. Listening to it in a dedicated stereo setup really kind of highlighted how left channel heavy that title is. All of the sound effects, because of the UI, are on the left hand side of the screen, so the left speaker is constantly going and the right speaker kind of just got scraps. So that was kind of annoying, and it just kind of, I don't think that's something they would have really been worried about back in 1995, 96 when that title came out, because on a CRT TV it didn't really matter. Then we have Final Fantasy VII, which on the other hand, other than the sound effects sounding a little bit crunchy, the music sounded phenomenal. Live running through a dedicated sound chip like that, it sounded absolutely excellent and preferable to the versions of the soundtrack which have been mastered for general listening that are available on streaming services. So that was a big surprise, but I guess that's the difference between a mastered audio file and a live chip basically playing back the equivalent to MIDI files or samples in real time. It was a real eye-opener, and I really appreciated not just the clarity of the actual samples themselves, but just how well they imaged and how much attention had been paid to the soundstage of the no one would have heard that back in the day, but here it was. So yeah, that was a very, very interesting experiment, and I'm glad that I did it. So really, what was the point of testing retro game hardware on the LS50 Wireless II? Am I saying that you need to go out there and buy a pair of speakers like this to get the most out of your old PS2 or Xbox? No, it's nothing like that. The reality is DACs have come a long way since 2001, and none of this hardware was designed to be listened to with the level of transparency and detail and precision that I was able to hear them with while I was testing them. But they still sounded fantastic, and that's the fascinating part. So that was my overall experience with the KEF LS50 Wireless II. So let's talk about things that I'd like to see improved on in the future. And I'll be upfront with you, none of them have anything to do with the speakers themselves. I just have a small number of things I'd like to see added to the app as it's updated over time. Most of these things that I'd like to see added aren't for me, but they're for people who are getting into hi-fi for the first time, because I feel like that's the perfect place for these speakers. These are a gateway to hi-fi, and I think a little bit more can be done with the app to make that transition for newcomers just that little bit easier. First of all, I'd like to see some presets for different sorts of rooms, like a lively room or a dampened room. Now, while I'm quite happy to dig into the EQ and tweak these things to my heart's content until I'm happy with the sound, your average consumer getting into hi-fi for the first time, that is a pretty daunting experience. And I think having little presets like this with these names on here and perhaps a description of what that means in the context of the room would be a fantastic thing to have there for these people. Likewise, with competitors in the soundbar space, since these can operate as an alternative to soundbars, I would like to see some of the feature sets of a lot of the apps in that space carried over, such as room correction, even if it was just to tweak the EQ based on a couple of different little features of your room. Other than that though, I don't really have any complaints at all. So yeah, I feel like with the new feature set of the KEF LS50 Wireless II, including its new wireless connection, which wasn't originally there in the previous iteration, it was introduced in the LSX, along with HDMI Arc, access to services like Tidal Connect now, as well as Spotify Connect, and other small little incremental updates like that. The LS50 Wireless II is kind of the perfect introduction to hi-fi for a lot of people, or at least it will be. And so regardless of if you're looking at getting into the speakers for music or for movies or for anything else, I feel like it's really the perfect starting point, as I don't really feel like, at least I don't think I could put together a system out of individual components that offers this much functionality at this higher quality at the KEF LS50 Wireless II's price point. It's definitely a tall order. Now, if you're someone with the previous version of the KEF LS50 Wireless and you're wondering about whether or not it's worth the upgrade, I think that's more of a question of how much do you value the new functionality afforded through things like HDMI Arc and of course Tidal Connect, as opposed to a question of sound quality, because I don't know that the jump in audio is there to warrant that upgrade, but the functionality, if those are features that you're looking for, might definitely make it worth it. Now, I had a fantastic time with the KEF LS50 Wireless II, and now I'm really curious to see if the same thing happens with the KEF LSX. We'll keep you posted. That's all for now, but if you would like more information on the KEF LS50 Wireless II, you can find a handy link in the description below. Now, if you have any questions, you can of course leave them below, or indeed any comments with your experience with either the previous version or the new one if you happen to have a copy. We'd love to hear from you. Alternatively, you can hit us up on social media, or if you're in Australia, you can give us a call. Thank you, as always, for watching, and bye for now.